Good morning and welcome to MDV The Blueprint with your host, Michael Della Vella. Today we are going to talk everything home inspections with David Sipple of Duke Inspection Services. Without further ado, let's speak with David. Good morning, David. How are you? I appreciate you coming on here and joining me for this great conversation we're about to have on home inspections. So let's begin. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Tell me about your background. Tell me about your company.
Thanks, Michael. Well, I really appreciate you inviting me and look forward to this. I'm David Sipple. A lot of people know me as Duke. Duke is a nickname I've had for a long, long time. And the company is called Duke Inspection Services, which is a full-time, locally owned and operated home inspection company that I started. And I've been doing home inspections, radon tests, residential inspections since 1999. Recently went past 9,000 home inspections, so I'm one of the more experienced inspectors around this area. And so I look forward to talking about that today, and hopefully people will get to learn a little bit about what a home inspection is, and you might have some good questions for me as well. So thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you mentioned. I always wondered why Duke. So that's a nickname of yours.
Duke is a nickname I've had ever since I can remember. I don't think my mom and dad liked the name David, so they never called me David unless I was getting in trouble. So I've always been called Duke all through school, all through college. And so when I started this company, uh, I thought it would be neat to have a phone number that would be Duke. So my main business number, 440-937-3853, also translates to 440-937-DUKE. And that was the biggest marketing, genius thing I could think of, was to call it that so that I could have the phone number. So, but a lot of people do know me as Duke, and it's just something, there's no good story to it. Like my parents, it has nothing to do with John Wayne or the number one response I get is, "Oh, I have a dog named Duke." That's what I get from a lot of people, but there's no great story behind it other than that's what a lot of people call me. So
That's fantastic. Now, you are a Clevelander. If I'm not mistaken, you grew up in Cleveland, St. Ignatius grad.
yes,
I don't know about after that, and I think you live. Are you a West Sider?
I grew up an East Sider, right? Grew up in Cleveland Heights, and found myself at St. Ignatius High School, and then I went on to John Carroll. So I have 8 years of the Jesuit education rolling around my brain. And slightly after getting married, my wife and I moved to Lorain County, mostly because of where she works. And so I live in Avon right now. Prior to that, had lived in Avon Lake. So we've been in Lorain County since 1997. So when I do get calls for home inspections, I'm very familiar with all the Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, East Side neighborhoods, but also obviously do a lot of inspections in Western Cuyahoga County, Lorain County, and I seem to know the areas pretty well, having grew up over there, now living here.
Question for you: what is involved if somebody wants to be a home inspector? What is actually involved? I would assume you're taking a bunch of classes. There's got to be qualifications, a test, and then I would assume, like what in the real estate business, you have to do continuing ed. So if you could elaborate on how's that process looks.
Well, when I first got started, you basically just start telling people you were a home inspector. There was no structure, there was no licensing, there was no certification needed. And about 5 years ago, the state of Ohio really got involved with the process. And so since that time, you do have to be licensed, and the licensing goes through the same division that yours does. We're under the umbrella of the Division of Real Estate, And so there are some training and some educational requirements involved. If somebody out there wants to become a home inspector, certainly they could call me and we'll provide that information. I'd be happy to tell them, how it works. But you do have to take some classroom training or on Zoom or over the internet. You have to have some qualifications in terms of working along with a licensed home inspector. There's an exam that is very difficult. There's a national home inspector exam that the state of Ohio uses, and it does take some study and sometimes some coursework there. But you do have to be licensed in the state of Ohio to be a home inspector.
If somebody's starting out, do you have to do some sort of mentorship or train under an inspector and get so many hours? Or are you just able to, I passed my test, I've got my insurance, and I'm ready to go?
Right. Part of that, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but part of that is a ride along, a work with. It might be 40 hours. You have to work with a licensed home inspector. There is a provision for that, right, you can't just go out and start, saying, hey, I'm a home inspector without, never having been out in the field and doing an inspection. So there is a component where, yes, you are working alongside of a licensed home inspector.
Fantastic. In your words, what is the responsibilities and the role that you play in the home buying process?
There's a couple different ways to answer that question. In many ways, you're a teacher. You're teaching people about this major investment. You're giving people information that they can learn about this $200,000, $400,000, $800,000 investment, right? You're with somebody for usually 2 to 3 hours. I like it when the buyer is standing 6, 7 feet away from me asking questions about the house. So you are a set of eyes and ears that is looking at the house in a different way because of your experience. Other people, such as the buyer, might be looking at the house for emotional reasons, right? It's in a great neighborhood. It's a cute house from the outside. It has a great kitchen, right? But we're, as home inspectors, we are there to help educate people about this property that they're about to sign on to, right? Part of what we're doing is a little bit of being a consumer advocate. We are there for the buyer. We are trying to help the buyer learn about this property so they can make an informed decision. Other than that, I think we're like a reporter. I tell people often when we start the process, this is a lot like me doing a book report. I'm doing a book report on your house, right? I'm going to tell you the condition of the roof. I'm going to tell you the condition or the age of the furnace. I'm going to run the water and tell you about drainage, right? So I'm doing a very detailed report. So I think we're teaching people, we're advocating for those people, and we're also reporting so that they have a product at the end, which is an actual report that they can rely on even months or years down the road if they need to go back and look at the report to do some maintenance or upkeep on the house. So
I have had the pleasure of watching you work, and the thing that I like that you do a lot is when my job is find a great home for my client and we get a great deal and it's a great neighborhood. But when it goes over to the inspection, the education that if you take the time to explain to someone, a young buyer who's never bought a home before, just all the intricacies of what's going on in this house and how things run. And here's how you should maintain it yearly. Look for this, do that. Now, having said all that, I'd love to get your opinion. The last 2 years, have you seen a decline in inspection? People are waiving inspections, which I cringe when I see people do that. Regardless, it's now become the norm. Is we don't need to do an inspection on this house. How do you feel about that? And do you not feel the same way that you're missing out on whether there's a problem with the house or not? It's the knowledge that you are giving somebody is invaluable.
So definitely last year, that was a big trend, more so than this year. Last year, business was down, not only for me, but other inspectors that I keep in contact with, because people are in a very, very competitive market. And we understand that. But, when someone says you're buying the house as is, don't you want to know what as is is? I mean, that's kind of corny, but it's true. You're going to buy, let's say, your first house, and you're going to sign a mortgage, and you're going to have responsibility. You want to know what you're getting. So, a good thing is, I think over the past year, so many people have come to realize that this is a real big mistake to skip the inspection altogether. What's really changed is everybody telling the inspector, and we understand why this is going on, it's okay, but everybody telling the inspector, hey, this is, as if to say we're not supposed to do a real thorough job. We understand what the market is, but we're still going to go in and do a thorough job because we want our client to learn about the house. Really, really big mistake when the person is not very handy, or if the person is buying their first home. They really need to get an inspection. Imagine if you're buying a house, let's say in our marketplace like Lakewood, where it's a 100-year-old house. There's a lot of things to talk about, and those are not necessarily big major deal killers or scary things, but you're teaching people how to maintain their house, how to operate certain things, and where certain things are. So the other trend, which is not as big as the skipping the inspection, is somehow the inspection report being passed along to party B and party C. So let's say party A can't buy the house for whatever reason, and now there's this inspection report out there in the ether, right? And somehow party B comes to look at the house, and there's an inspection report that was done like a month ago. We're seeing that as becoming a trend that's happening more and more often, where party B says, well, hey, I think I'll save $400 because somehow we have this inspection report from a month ago. That's another big mistake, because just think of the crazy weather we've had this year. Remember in August, we had that unbelievable storm. I think that was a Wednesday or Thursday night, right? Well, imagine that inspection was done prior to that storm, and now you're buying the house after that storm. Isn't it possible that something may have happened to that house in that period? But to answer your question, really, I think this is becoming less and less common where people are skipping inspections, although it's still happening.
I think that it is definitely going away. And in 2024, I think it will be the norm again. And if you're a young buyer out there, I don't care if you have your agent write it in the contract that informational purposes only. Do an inspection. Do an inspection. It gives you an out if something is wrong. So tell me, how do you start your home inspections? What are the common issues or problems that one can encounter on a home inspection?
Well, I like to start my inspection by asking the client what concerns they might have. I want to find out if they've walked through the house already, if there's anything they saw. And oftentimes they'll say, oh, yes, I saw a stain up on the second floor ceiling, or I'm worried about the sump pump. It looks a little old. And so, I'm trying to do an assessment of what they've already learned about the house and what concerns they have going in. I will ask them if they've ever been through the process before, because a lot of times, no, they haven't. It's their first house. They've never been to a home inspection. They have no idea what's about to happen, right? And so by talking to them, I can get a feel for their concerns, but also what their expectations would be. And then I try to explain to them, again, I like to say, I'm doing a book report here. We're going to write all this down. And if I'm talking about something, it'll be in the report. So, in terms of what are commonly found, especially with houses that are, let's say, more than 30 years old, it's usually examples of things that were done back in those days. But by today's standards, maybe they're not up to code or up to today's standards. So you have to be careful to explain to people, we're not there to do a code inspection. We have no authority The cities, the state, the county gives me no authority to write something up as a code violation, so to speak. But there's a way to communicate that, maybe this wiring isn't connected the way it should be by today's standards. Maybe these outlets aren't up to date. Maybe they're not grounded. Maybe they're not GFCI outlets. These are very common things that happen at home inspections. And I think good home inspectors will make sure they're communicating to the customer, this is not unique to your house. This is a very common issue, and it usually has a pretty simple repair or fix to it. So I would say electrical issues, especially in older houses, would be the number one issues that we find.
How do you feel about homes? And I know there's a ton of them that are still knob and tube through the ceilings, the walls, the attic, but have got updated panels. What's your feeling on that?
Well, from a practical standpoint, with a lot of people having a home office, a lot of people having these giant TVs, myself included, right? The man cave or the TV room. Some people turning their garage into a little workshop. The big thing with that knob and tube wiring is that if something is connected, it's never going to be grounded. Knob and tube wiring doesn't have a grounding characteristic to it. The newer wiring, which is typically referred to as Romex, if you cut that open, there's a hot, a neutral, and a ground. As long as something is going through that knob and tube, it's never really grounded. So if you know for sure you're going to make one of the bedrooms in your 75-year-old house your home office, you probably need to rewire that room. You don't have to necessarily rewire the entire house, but your outlets will never be grounded if they're running through that knob and tube. So from a practical standpoint, that's really the biggest effect on that. But as that wiring gets older, it can become very brittle. It can damage very easily. You're not supposed to cover it with insulation. So if somebody were to go and add insulation into the walls or into the house up in the attic, you're not really supposed to do that. So we see a lot of houses that still have knob and tube wiring. I think the most practical part of that is that the individual outlets can just never be grounded. So in certain cases, you're going to have to update it.
And I know that there's insurance carriers that are not insuring knob and tube homes, but it's such a large part of our market.
Right.
The expense to get rid of all the knob and tube and start from scratch is it's huge. I'm glad you mentioned that because it is common. I think it does scare people a little bit. Oh my gosh, what am I buying? But it is extremely common that we have it. When you see a new panel, the electrical, has it truly been updated, or is just the panel and breakers been updated?
We run into that all the time. The other thing that I always tell my clients, especially first-time home buyers, when it comes to electrical projects, it's the labor that gets you. So the wiring, the electrician goes out and buys a couple boxes full of wire, and the panel itself is not very expensive. It's the labor. So people will say, well, gee, how much is this going to cost to update all this wiring? And they could call 2 or 3 different electricians and they're going to get 2 or 3 different price quotes because so much of it is that labor component. And in the past couple of years, just like everything else, it's gotten really expensive. So let me ask you this question. In this market where there's such tight inventory, are sellers giving clients the ability to have some of these issues checked out prior to closing? Or is it something that the buyer's just going to have to assume the risk? Meaning, if I go and I tell a client, yeah, you've got all this knob and tube wiring, none of these outlets are grounded, and the people really want to get a price quote for what it's going to take to update that. In years past, 5, 10 years ago, there might be some room where the seller would say, oh, okay, we'll bring in your electrician and we'll get a price quote. And am I wrong? Nowadays, that's not happening.
It's not happening today. When people do inspections in this past year, it's for informational purposes only, they may write that they're not going to ask for any repairs up to $1,000, $5,000. That's negotiated. But it's not uncommon for before the close that people want to bring people in for stuff that they're going to do, and sellers, if it's been a nice transaction, they will let people come in and give quotes. But it's coming back where it is just going to be the norm.
The reason I ask that is because home inspectors, not only myself, but all the guys and women that I know that do this, we have information written into our reports encouraging people to get these issues checked out within the confines of the contingencies of their real estate contract. Because we've all gotten this phone call, and I'm sure realtors get this phone call too. Hey, you inspected my house 6 months ago, and I've got an electrician over here, and he wants $4,900 to fix, what you said needed to be
That's
fixed.
common. Yeah.
And I'll say, well, yes, but those issues were in the report. And the client is sometimes upset because they'll say, well, you didn't tell me it was going to be $5,000. And our response always is, well, yes, but we encouraged you to get it checked out. So part of what I've been doing and other home inspectors have been doing is, again, when we first get started, let people know what the process is, and that in this market, the seller might not let you get these things checked out, but you have to be careful to budget realistically. Is that a good way to approach an issue like that?
I think you're spot on. I really do. It has come up. What I do is on any inspection is I go through the reports. I like when there's a summary or here's the most important critical matters, but I go through it. We have a discussion what we're going to ask for. If things are just maintenance, it's usually easy to navigate through, but it's the items that you're talking about that you could be talking $5,000+ that at least you need to educate the buyer. You're spot on.
Sometimes people are so excited to get that dream house. They're so excited and so eager. You can tell they're not maybe paying as much attention as we would like them to pay. And that's why the reports are so detailed and the reports take time to generate. There's a little bit of, cover yourself that, hey, we did talk about this. But I've been on so many inspections where you're trying to tell somebody, this is an expensive fix, maybe not now, but 6 months, a year, 2 years from now. And they're just so excited that it's got the cutest patio and, this is like the house I grew up in. And so we're trying to cover ourselves with these detailed reports that we've discussed these issues.
What red flags could come up in an inspection that you may see and maybe start talking that, I think this is bigger than what you may want to take on. I see structural damage here. I see, is that a common thing that
Yes.
you see?
The biggest thing that I run into along those lines are indications of moisture, possible mold or mildew, or dampness issues that were not disclosed. In my experience, if something is disclosed, people are usually pretty cool about it. They know what they're getting into. If there's something that we find that's rather obvious to the inspector, but it's not on the disclosure, that's when the red flags start to go up. So, maybe in the basement, maybe there's signs of moisture, dampness. Inspectors try to go physically up in the attic. If you can't safely get in the attic, you're definitely going to get a ladder and look into the attic from whatever access panel there is. And sometimes you'll find stains or possible mold or mildew up in the attic. And so it's usually issues that are not disclosed that people are learning for the first time on a Tuesday morning at 9:30, when they're doing the inspection, that tend to raise the red flag of concern. The other issue, of course, structural. You find some big crack in the foundation or significantly sloping floors that people didn't see when they walked through the house before. But I would say the biggest red flag that I typically am getting the feedback on from my customers are issues having to do with wet basements, damp areas, stains, or possible mold or mildew that we find during the inspection.
Have you ever had an inspection where you've said, Guys, you may not want me to continue with this inspection, but I want to bring this to you and you tell me, have you ever had an issue like that something was so, I like, wow,
Rarely,
I
but
shouldn't.
yes, maybe. Well, here's how I usually phrase that. Uh, I will give people the opportunity to put the inspection on hold if there is some big major issue that I find, such as a huge crack in the foundation or a potential mold or mildew. Just as an aside, inspectors are very careful not to say something is mold, because until you have it tested, it might not be an active mold problem on that day. It's a little bit of legal and covering ourselves. You could say something is mold. Someone goes out and spends hundreds of dollars to have it scientifically tested, and it turns out it's not really mold. It's just some kind of a stain. But sometimes you can smell it, you can see it, and you are very concerned that it could be a mold issue. So it's very rare that that happens. But if there's obviously some huge concern, I might say to the client, do you want to get this issue checked out first before you spend the money for an entire home inspection? Honestly, sometimes the realtors seem to be a little put off by that, because they're going to need a full inspection report if they're going back to the seller. But that kind of a thing doesn't happen very often, where that I can think of. I have had over the years maybe two or three times where the buyer just canceled the inspection midway through. They found some issue that they just didn't think they could live with, did a quick math calculation in their head that they're not going to spend this much money to fix that problem, and just looked at me and said, okay, I'm done. Send me an invoice. Bye. Maybe that's three or four times out of the thousands and thousands of inspections that I've ever done. So,
I've had it happen once or twice. So it happens. And the last thing I want to do, and I'm sure you want to do, is give people the wrong advice to, oh, you know what, coat of paint will fix that. You'll be fine.
right.
If it doesn't seem right, I don't want someone to go forward. And I love the honesty that an inspector will bring. I'm not looking for you to cover anything up. I want it. I want the truth.
Yeah, you don't want the phone call 6 months later. Right.
I'm going to ask 3 quick questions, so we'll try to get them quick so we can get you out of here. David, should you test for radon on inspections?
The EPA recommends all home buyers test for radon. So that means if you have a basement or you don't have a basement. That means if it's an old house or if it's a brand new house. Radon is just Mother Nature. Radon is an element found in nature. So if you have a concern about radon, yes, you should test, because the only way to know whether or not the house has a radon problem is to do a test. Now, I know that that's contingent upon how you wrote up the contract. If you checked off that box on the contract saying you want a radon test, then certainly we can do that as part of the home inspection. But in today's market, where people are just happy to have won the offer, right? People are happy that their bid is accepted. We're seeing less and less people include radon testing as part of the home inspection process. Okay, test it after you move in. So yes, people should test their house for radon. Radon is found all over Northeast Ohio. There's no way you can say, oh, you don't need to worry about radon. There's no radon in, like, insert any city here, right? You can't say there's no radon in Lakewood. Well, I could show you houses in Lakewood that have radon mitigation systems. This house has a basement. There's no radon. It doesn't have a basement. This house has a slab. There's no radon here. Okay, well, I could send you copies of reports that I've done on houses that have slabs that have high levels of radon. So the answer is yes. If you're concerned about it, yes, you should test, because there's no other way to know unless you do a test.
David, give me David Sipple's blueprint for success.
I try to inspect the house as if I was going to buy the house myself. I follow the state standards for what the bare minimum would have to be. Like, certain things have to be included in your inspection report. But I'm also going to mention anything that I see in the report that might be of concern. Now, some things don't make it into the report because they're outside the scope of the home inspection. But my blueprint for success, and I've been self-employed doing this job now for 25 years, so I like to think that I have had some success in this business, is just the way I communicate with my client, which to me is always that buyer. I really, really appreciate all the referrals that I get from real estate agents and mortgage companies and attorneys. But think about it. In the end, that buyer is really my client. That buyer is who I'm really working for. So I try to focus on that and to be there to answer questions and to not be an alarmist and to call out things when they need to be called out and then just explain other things when they just need an explanation. So I think I've never tried to get too big, where I've never tried to grow a big, huge company where I've got inspectors that I can't be accountable for. I've always liked just having my own little company where, for better or worse, if you hire Duke Inspection Services, I'm the guy who's showing up to do the inspection. And that way I can make sure that the customer's getting the type of inspection I would want to get if I were buying a house.
Love that, David. Love that. So finally, now let's tell everyone how you get in touch with Duke Inspection Services and David Sipple.
Thank you. Well, again, as we talked before, so the phone number is 440-937-DUKE, which is easy to remember. So 440-937-3853. And my website is www.dukeinspection.com. And there's a way to schedule an appointment right through that website. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, but the best way is just to pick up the phone and give me a call.
Well, you have been a fantastic guest. I have enjoyed this so much. We could keep talking until, it gets dark out, but I think I've taken up a lot of your time. I thank you so much for doing this, and I will see you soon.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Make sure to follow us on social media at MDV The Blueprint on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. We post a ton of great content. And please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channel so you never miss out on an episode. Thanks again, and see you next time.